Let's talk about something that could be the difference between long-term achievement and momentary applause. There is a phenomenon in neuroscience called dopamine release from anticipated reward. When you tell others about your goals, your brain releases a little hit of dopamine, just enough to feel like you've already done something. Here's the catch. That burst of reward makes you less likely to actually follow through. You've satisfied your craving prematurely. You didn't earn it, you just talked about it. The truth is, when you share your plans too early, you're outsourcing accountability. You invite unnecessary validation. Your focus shifts from internal execution to external performance, from your mission to their opinion. This is dangerous for your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making, focus, and long-term planning. It begins to respond to likes instead of actions. You become reactive, not strategic. When you work in silence, the reward system remains aligned with real progress. You're rewiring your brain through neuroplasticity. Each repeated action strengthens the neural circuits responsible for skill, grit, and discipline. You don't need applause to build momentum. You need friction. You need silence, because it's in silence where neural focus thrives, where the world disappears and your mind enters the flow state, a deeply immersive condition where peak performance lives. Also consider this: social pressure elevates cortisol, the brain's stress hormone. It narrows your thinking, impairs memory, and reduces your capacity to solve problems creatively. But solitude, silence, that regulates your nervous system. It sharpens your thoughts. It gives you clarity. So instead of posting your plan, the most powerful people don't talk about their moves. They make them. The real evidence isn't what you say. It's what you build. So I'll leave you with this: talk less, train more, think deeper, move quieter. And when it's time, they won't hear you coming. They'll just see what you've done. Would you like this formatted for a YouTube voiceover, Instagram reel, or live keynote delivery next? When we set a goal, whether it's launching a business, writing a book, or transforming our health, the brain immediately begins to orient itself toward that future reward. It recruits the mesolimbic dopamine system, a critical pathway that connects motivation to action. In this process, dopamine acts not just as a feel-good chemical, but as a neuromodulator that signals anticipation and drives behavior toward it. However, when we verbalize that goal too early, especially publicly, we accidentally trigger that same dopamine system without the corresponding action. The brain interprets the verbal commitment as partial completion, releasing a premature dopamine. This creates a false sense of progress that satisfies the craving for achievement, even though no real steps have been taken. This premature reward dampens the urgency to act. The brain begins to associate progress not with the work itself, but with the social reward of having shared the goal. Likes, praise, or even polite nods from others act as substitute reinforcements. From a neurobiological standpoint, the brain is being rewarded for talking, not doing. This misalignment leads to reduced follow-through. Repeatedly announcing goals trains the brain to become more responsive to external validation than internal progress. Over time, this reshapes the brain's reward circuitry. What was once an internally driven pursuit becomes an externally oriented performance. Dopaminergic firing begins to favor attention and recognition over grit and process. This dynamic is further compounded by the brain's tendency to conserve energy. When the mind believes it has partially achieved a goal via social expression, it often redirects resources away from the goal itself. The anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors error detection and motivational conflict, quiets down. The urgency that should push us forward gets dulled. In contrast, when plans are kept private, dopamine is tied to real effort and measurable feedback. Micro wins, like finishing a draft or completing a training session, produce authentic neurochemical reinforcement. This consistent pairing between effort and reward strengthens the habit-forming circuits in the basal ganglia, encouraging repetition and perseverance. The issue isn't goal setting. It's how the reward system is manipulated by the environment. Social media, peer conversations, and even accountability groups can accidentally hijack the reward process. While intention sharing is often seen as motivational, it can short-circuit the brain's ability to associate pleasure with actual execution. Working silently prevents this distortion. It preserves the brain's natural motivation circuitry by delaying gratification until real outcomes are achieved. Dopamine hit is not removed, it's deferred. This makes it stronger, more stable, and anchored in action rather than applause. Let me know if you'd like the next keynote point expanded similarly. Focus is a limited neural resource. It's managed primarily by the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for goal-directed behavior, decision-making, and sustained attention. When we direct our attention toward a specific task or ambition, we're recruiting neural networks that prioritize long-term objectives over short-term distractions. This internal alignment is critical for building momentum and maintaining consistency. However, when we share our intentions publicly, especially in early stages, we introduce a competing signal, the desire for approval. The brain now has to manage not only the mechanics of executing a plan, but also the social implications of that plan. Neural circuits involved in social cognition, particularly those in the medial prefrontal cortex, become activated, shifting attention away from the task itself and toward the perceived judgment of others. This shift can be subtle but powerful. The focus transitions from process to performance, from internal drive to external image, even without explicit feedback. The anticipation of how others will react to our goals begins to consume attentional bandwidth. This creates a kind of cognitive noise that disrupts the deep work states necessary for real progress. The default mode network, which supports internal reflection and self-referential thinking, can become overactive when we begin to imagine how others perceive our goals. This undermines task-positive networks responsible for sustained effort and attentional control. As a result, onto the actual mechanics of execution, because it's now filtering and adjusting behavior based on imagined external response. This dynamic becomes even more pronounced in environments where social validation is easily accessible. Posting plans online or casually broadcasting them to peers activates reward-related areas, like the ventral striatum, in response to likes, affirmations, or praise. The focus is now not just divided, it's rerouted entirely toward maintaining a socially acceptable identity rather than an effective strategy. The concern isn't just distraction, it's redirection of intention. The brain is incredibly responsive to what it perceives as threat or opportunity. When social feedback is introduced, the brain begins optimizing for reputation management rather than problem solving. This dilutes cognitive energy that should be allocated to action steps and instead directs it toward performance anxiety or impression control. In this state, even minor setbacks can be exaggerated. The fear of public failure activates the amygdala, increasing stress and risk aversion. Tasks that once felt like creative exploration become pressure-filled performance. This weakens resilience, especially in the early, fragile stages of goal pursuit, where the work is uncertain and progress is slow. By externalizing the goal prematurely, the locus of control shifts. Instead of operating from a place of autonomy and intention, the brain starts reacting to an audience. Neural focus becomes fragmented, and the clarity required for sustained, effective effort begins to erode. The brain and body respond to pressure through a finely tuned stress system. At the core of this system is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis, which regulates the release of cortisol, the primary stress hormone. Cortisol is essential in appropriate doses. It mobilizes energy, heightens alertness, and prepares the body for action. But when elevated chronically or unnecessarily, it begins to impair cognitive flexibility, memory, and decision-making. When goals are shared publicly, especially in early phases, the brain interprets this exposure as a form of social evaluation. This triggers a mild but measurable stress response. Anticipation of being watched, judged, or failing in front of others activates the amygdala, which in turn signals the HPA axis to release cortisol. The result is an internal state of vigilance that diverts energy away from focus and learning and toward emotional self-monitoring. Social pressure is one of the most potent forms of psychological stress. The fear of negative evaluation, whether real or imagined, can subtly elevate baseline cortisol levels, especially in individuals with high achievement orientation. This elevation doesn't always feel like panic. It often manifests as irritability, mental fatigue, or low-grade anxiety that disrupts flow and mental clarity. The prefrontal cortex, which handles working memory and strategic planning, becomes less efficient under this load. Privately held goals allow the nervous system to remain regulated. When we remove the element of social exposure, the brain can devote more resources to executive function rather than self-presentation. Cognitive energy is redirected to planning, iteration, and problem solving instead of impression management. This shift enables the brain to stay in a high-performance state without activating stress circuits unnecessarily. Performance optimization depends on controlled stress exposure. Athletes, for example, use progressive overload to train their systems without overwhelming them. The same principle applies neurologically. Sharing goals too early adds unproductive stress that offers no learning benefit. It merely raises the stakes without increasing skill. This creates a mismatch between pressure and preparation, which impairs growth. Reduced cortisol not only improves focus, it supports memory consolidation. When stress is low, the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for encoding long-term memory, functions more efficiently. This means that the learning gained through effortful work is more likely to stick. In contrast, high stress reduces hippocampal volume over time, which can limit the ability to retain and apply complex knowledge. Silence around goals can also reduce anticipatory anxiety, which is a form of stress that arises not from the task itself, but from imagining potential failure or embarrassment. This kind of anxiety operates below conscious awareness, but drains cognitive resources nonetheless. When intentions are kept private, this loop is interrupted. The brain doesn't have to simulate social outcomes, which preserves attention for the task at hand. Even subtle social stressors, like the imagined disappointment of peers or family, can lead to behavioral inhibition. This stress response constrains risk-taking and creativity, making it more difficult to explore unconventional solutions or adapt when plans need to change. In a low-stress, private context, the brain is more flexible, more adaptable, and better equipped to operate at its cognitive peak. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change its structure and function in response to experience. It is the fundamental mechanism by which new skills are learned, habits are formed, and behaviors become automatic. Every time we repeat a behavior with focused attention, we are strengthening the synaptic connections between neurons involved in that behavior. These strengthened circuits become more efficient over time, allowing the action to be performed with less conscious effort. Repetition is essential because the brain operates on a use-dependent model. Neural pathways that are used repeatedly become myelinated, insulated by a fatty substance called myelin that increases the speed and efficiency of electrical signals. This biological investment occurs only when the brain perceives that a certain behavior is relevant, repeated, and valuable. Announcements, in contrast, are not perceived as useful behavioral inputs by the nervous system, and thus they don't receive the same plasticity-related reinforcement. When someone talks about a goal rather than working on it, they engage different neural systems. Verbalizing intentions activates language and social cognition networks, but it doesn't engage the motor, sensory, or procedural learning systems that are necessary for skill acquisition. Without activating the relevant circuits through actual task performance, the brain has no incentive to rewire itself for efficiency or mastery. The repetition must be action-based, not symbolic. Procedural memory, which governs how we perform skills and routines, is encoded through consistent execution, not through discussion. The basal ganglia, a brain structure involved in habit formation, responds to patterns of behavior that are repeated over time. Each execution strengthens the signal-to-noise ratio in the brain, making the behavior easier to initiate and sustain. This process requires friction, trial, and error, not declarations of intent. In early stages of learning, the prefrontal cortex is highly engaged, monitoring each step consciously. But with repetition, the brain offloads control to subcortical systems, allowing the behavior to become more automatic. This transition from conscious to subconscious execution is how mastery is formed. Verbalizing a goal does not initiate this handoff. Only repeated, structured practice creates the conditions necessary for the brain to shift from deliberate effort to automatic execution. The plasticity of the brain is also time-sensitive and context-dependent. It is most responsive when there is feedback, either success or failure. That informs future attempts. Silent repetition allows the brain to focus on these feedback loops without interference from social approval or criticism. Each iteration becomes a micro-adjustment that slowly shapes neural circuits toward greater precision and efficiency. Repetition also conditions the emotional. When action is paired with manageable levels of effort and reward, the limbic system begins to associate the behavior with a sense of progress and satisfaction. This builds what neuroscientists call affective tagging, where behavior is emotionally marked as meaningful or rewarding. Talking about the behavior without doing it disrupts this loop, producing a reward signal without the corresponding neurological investment. The plasticity of the brain responds more strongly to internally rewarding experiences when the motivation to act is tied to curiosity, purpose, or personal growth. The neural changes that follow tend to be deeper and longer lasting. This results in more efficient learning, stronger memory consolidation, and a greater likelihood of repeating the behavior in the future, even in the absence of external recognition or reward. The flow state is a deeply immersive mental condition characterized by intense concentration, a sense of effortlessness, and a distortion of time. It emerges when the brain is fully engaged in a task that challenges one's skill set. This state is associated with heightened activity in the prefrontal cortex, particularly the dorsolateral region, which is responsible for sustained attention, working memory, and executive control. Silence provides the optimal conditions for entering flow because it reduces sensory input that competes for cognitive bandwidth. When auditory distractions are minimized, the brain can allocate more resources toward task-relevant networks. This internal quietness allows the default mode network, which is associated with mind-wandering and self-referential thought, to downregulate while the task-positive network becomes dominant, supporting uninterrupted focus and goal-directed behavior. In silent settings, the locus coeruleus, which regulates attention through the release of norepinephrine, operates with greater precision. Without sudden environmental shifts or social interruptions, this neuromodulatory system can maintain a steady state of arousal that is optimal for deep focus. This neurological stability enhances cognitive control, allowing thoughts and actions to align more fluidly with the demands of the task. The prefrontal cortex plays a key role in sequencing complex actions, suppressing irrelevant stimuli, and integrating feedback. In a quiet environment, this area is less burdened by the need to constantly shift attention between external distractions and internal representation. As a result, neural signaling becomes more efficient, supporting both convergent thinking for problem solving and divergent thinking for creative exploration. Flow also involves the temporary suppression of self-consciousness and inner critique. Silence reduces the triggers that often reactivate the medial prefrontal cortex, which governs self-monitoring and social evaluation. By decreasing social noise, both literal and psychological, the brain is less likely to enter evaluative or judgmental states that interrupt creative or analytical momentum. Environmental silence can also influence the rhythm of brain oscillations, particularly in the alpha. These lower frequency waves are associated with relaxed alertness and creative ideation. When auditory distractions are removed, these oscillations can dominate, facilitating a mental state that is both calm and highly attentive, supporting tasks that require insight, synthesis, or deep pattern recognition. The hippocampus, involved in memory encoding and spatial navigation, also benefits from quiet work environments. With fewer distractions, sensory processing becomes more precise, allowing for better integration of new information. This precision enhances learning and the ability to connect disparate ideas, a process crucial to both innovation and mastery.